The morning began long before the sun considered rising, in that colorless hour when the world feels half-assembled. The forward airfield crouched under a low ceiling of mist, flooded with the smells that defined wartime aviation: cold avgas, damp canvas, and metal that had sweated through the night. A generator chugged somewhere near the operations tent, coughing like an old man refusing to die. Beyond it, faint silhouettes of parked Mustangs waited in rows, their wings beaded with droplets that glittered like frozen mercury whenever a lantern swung by. Mud sucked at the boots of the mechanics trudging in for first shift. Their tool bags clinked, steel against steel, a music of exhaustion that echoed across the hard-packed earth. Most kept their heads low against the wind, muttering about weather reports, supply delays, or last night's poker losses. No one noticed the smallest figure moving among them. Helen Ward walked with a quiet, steady purpose, her oversized canvas coveralls flapping at the cuffs, sleeves stained in the places only real work leaves marks. Her dark hair was pinned back under a knit cap, her breath fogging in soft, rhythmic puffs. She carried her tool roll the way a surgeon might carry instruments meant to save lives rather than machines. The men never paid her much mind. To them she was an anomaly. One woman in a forest of oil-streaked uniforms and cigarette smoke, a wartime necessity, a name on the roster, someone who should have been handing out papers in an office, not crawling under fighters built to tear open the sky. But Helen didn't flinch from their dismissive glances. She walked straight toward Mustang 214, her assigned aircraft, placing her palm lightly on its cowling as if greeting a friend. The metal was cold enough to sting. It didn't matter. She listened anyway, because before anyone else saw anything, Helen always heard it first. Helen crouched beneath the leading edge of Mustang 214, her gloved fingers sliding across the rivet line as though feeling for a pulse. The field was still dim, the light barely strong enough to distinguish metal from shadow, but she didn't need her eyes. Not yet. The Merlin engine inside the cowling was cooling from its overnight run, metal contracting in tiny, uneven clicks. To most mechanics that sound meant nothing, thermal shift, routine as breathing. But to Helen, each click carried a tone, a spacing, a rhythm. Engines had personalities, voices. She didn't expect anyone else to understand that. A sharp laugh cut across the line as Torres, one of the senior mechanics, swaggered past with a wrench hanging from his belt. "Hey, Ward," he called. "You tuning that Mustang like it's a church organ?" The men around him snickered. It never bothered her, not really. Mockery rolled off her like rain off the Mustang's wing. Helen brushed her thumb across a bolt head, listening to the faint metallic vibration echoing inside the cowling. The pattern was off. Not catastrophic, not dangerous, but uneven, like a violin played by someone whose bow hand trembled. It was subtle enough that no gauge would show it. Subtle enough that Torres would call it imagination. She stood and opened the engine panel. The morning light caught the engine block, illuminating the V-shape of the 12 cylinders. Merlin engines always looked coiled, waiting, like predators ready to leap skyward. Helen leaned in, eyes narrowing. There it was again. A flutter in the coolant bracket, barely perceptible. A vibration out of harmony with the engine's natural frequency. Torres rolled his eyes. "Don't waste time on ghost noises. These birds fly fine." Helen didn't argue. She never did. But she knew. Something was wrong. And only she seemed able to hear it. By mid-morning, the field had shaken off its gray shell, sunlight slicing through the thinning mist and glinting off Mustang canopies. The pilots drifted in like hawks returning to familiar perches, exchanging half-hearted greetings while mechanics finished their inspections. Helen kept her head down, signing off 214's morning checklist, but the murmur of pilot chatter drifted toward her in scraps carried by the wind. Felt a shudder mid-climb, thought the damn thing was gonna buck me off. Mine overheated at altitude yesterday, no warning. Coolant pressure spiked on takeoff, nearly aborted. Helen froze. She'd heard every word, and her stomach tightened with each one. Mustangs did not shudder without cause. They did not spike coolant pressure without a reason. And they did not overheat unless something deep inside the system was crying for attention. She walked toward the operations tent, pretending to look for a misplaced tool, listening without appearing to. Every pilot described something slightly different, but to Helen it was all the same story. Vibrations building under load, stresses shifting through components that shouldn't shift at all. Later that afternoon, a Mustang limped back to the field, trailing a thin, ghostly ribbon of white steam. The ground crew swarmed as the pilot climbed out, pale and furious. "Coolant line blew clean off," he snapped. Felt like a hammer went through the nose. Helen approached cautiously, eyes fixed on the ruptured line. The break was too smooth, too precise. Stress fracture. She swallowed hard. She brought the report to the maintenance chief. Tight brackets, harmonic stress, fatigue in the coolant supports. He didn't even look up. "Ward, we're short on parts, behind on schedules, and drowning in missions. We don't chase hypotheticals. We fix what's broken." But that was the problem, Helen thought. By the time it's broken, it's already too late. The briefing room buzzed with the brittle tension of men preparing for a mission they already suspected would go wrong. Maps lay pinned beneath mugs of cold coffee, flight paths drawn in thick wax pencil. Escort run at first light. Heavy bomber group inbound. Probable Luftwaffe interception. The kind of assignment that demanded every Mustang the squadron could field. Helen stood just outside the doorway, clipboard held tight to her chest, listening as the commanding officer barked orders. He spoke of altitude, fuel loads, rendezvous points, everything except the condition of the aircraft themselves. The pilots nodded, stoic as always, though a few shifted uneasily. They knew their planes better than the officers did. They'd felt the vibrations, the hesitation in the climb, the strange, wavering note in the Merlin's voice. 18 Mustangs were slated to fly. 18 engines Helen didn't trust. She made her way to the maintenance office again, report in hand. The edges crumpled from how many times she'd rehearsed this. The maintenance chief looked up as she entered, annoyance flickering across his face like a porch light in a storm. "Ward, unless you've brought me a miracle, I don't have time." "It's the coolant bracket," she said firmly. "It's flexing under load. Just a fraction, but enough to stress the line. If the vibrations sink at the wrong RPM..." "Enough." He scraped his chair back. "We don't have replacements. Supplies 2 weeks out. Command wants every bird airborne at dawn. If I ground even one Mustang over a hunch, I answer to the colonel." Helen pressed her lips together, fighting to keep her voice steady. "It's not a hunch. It's a harmonic failure, and if they take full boost, then they'll fly faster," he snapped. "This is a war ward, not a classroom. Patch what's broken. Leave the dreaming to engineers." She stared at him, heart pounding. Because she knew, not dreamed, not feared, knew that a disaster was already moving toward them, quiet as a crack forming in metal. It happened in the dead silence between night and dawn, when the world feels suspended. Too dark to be morning, too late to be night. Helen had stayed on the line longer than she should have, double-checking torque settings on Mustang 214, pretending she wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. The air had grown colder, heavy with the smell of wet earth and exhaust residue. Then the sound split the field. A shriek. High, metallic, wrong. Helen's head snapped up just as a Mustang on a late shakedown run staggered in, its landing lights wobbling in the dark. The engine coughed, belched steam, and the aircraft slammed onto the runway hard enough to bounce. Ground crews sprinted toward it, flashlights jerking across the darkness. The canopy flew open before the wheels even stopped rolling. The pilot climbed out, shaking with adrenaline and fury. "Coolant pressure dropped to 0 in 3 seconds, he shouted. "Lost thrust, alarms everywhere, I barely made it back." Helen reached the aircraft first. Steam still hissed from the cowling as she pulled the panel open, the metal scorching her gloves. Inside, the coolant line hung limp, sheared cleanly away. The bracket meant to secure it had fractured in a perfect arc. Exactly the failure she had warned about. Her stomach twisted. She ran her fingers along the brake, feeling the pattern of stress like reading Braille. The metal hadn't snapped from impact. It had given out from vibration. Slow, relentless pressure from an engine asking too much of a weakened part. The maintenance chief arrived, breath fogging in the cold. "What the hell happened?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She held up the cracked bracket, letting the flashlight glow catch the fracture. "This," she said quietly, "is what's happening to every Mustang on this field." For the first time, the chief didn't argue. He looked at the broken metal, then at the row of sleeping fighters waiting for dawn, and the color drained from his face. The hangar lights buzzed overhead, throwing long yellow reflections across the concrete as the damaged Mustang was rolled inside. Mechanics circled it like surgeons around a dying patient, voices overlapping in panicked fragments. "No spares, none, checked the crate twice. Bracket's a total loss. We can't weld that in the field. Too thin, too stressed." Helen stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded tightly across her chest, listening to the chaos swirl. 18 Mustangs were scheduled to launch in less than 4 hours. 18 engines depending on the same flawed bracket. And they had nothing. No replacement parts, no reinforcements, no time. The maintenance chief paced, running both hands through his thinning hair. "We ground the squadron. We lose the bombers. We send them up like this." His voice cracked. "We'll be scraping pilots off French soil by noon." Everyone fell silent. Helen stepped forward, almost without realizing it. "The bracket doesn't need to be replaced," she said calmly. "It needs dampening." Torres snorted. "Dampening? With what, Ward? Good intentions?" Helen ignored him. She approached the damaged bracket, tracing the fracture line with a fingertip. The break wasn't from force. It was from resonance, harmonic oscillation, a deadly lullaby sung by a Merlin engine running near full boost. She closed her eyes briefly. Memory surfaced. Her father in the Dust Bowl years, kneeling beside a failing tractor, binding a cracked belt with strips of fabric and wire, teaching 11-year-old Helen that machines didn't always need perfection to survive. Sometimes they just needed cleverness. She opened her tool roll with steady hands and pulled out a thick, silver-gray roll of Army-issue duct tape. The room stared. Torres laughed outright. "You planning to gift-wrap the engine?" "No," Helen said, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm going to keep it alive." Helen didn't flinch under the stares. She knelt beside the engine mount, unspooling the duct tape with a slow, deliberate pull that filled the hangar with a soft, tearing whisper. The mechanics watched with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, like they were witnessing someone attempt surgery with a pocket knife. She examined the bracket housing again, mapping out the vibration paths in her mind. The fracture pattern told a story. Energy traveling in a loop, building tension at the weakest point until the metal surrendered. If she could break that cycle, disperse the vibration, give the coolant line even a fraction more stability. She started wrapping, not haphazardly, not desperately. Each band of tape was laid at a precise angle, crossing the last, forming a lattice that hugged the bracket with reinforced tension. She added secondary strips to redirect harmonic flex, overlapping layers to absorb shock. It was engineering in motion, instinctive, exact, invisible to anyone who didn't speak the language of machines. Torres shook his head. "This is insane." The maintenance chief stepped closer, squinting. "What are you actually doing, Ward?" Helen kept working. "The bracket fails because it vibrates at the engine's harmonic frequency under boost. Metal meets resonance, resonance meets fatigue." She cinched the final strip tight. "But duct tape, this tape, has layered fibers. It absorbs micro-movement. It redistributes tension. It keeps the vibration from sinking." The chief paused. "You're telling me tape can stop a Merlin from shaking itself apart?" "I'm telling you," Helen said, wiping her hands on her coveralls, "that this might be the only thing we have that can." Silence. Then he nodded once, grudging, terrified, hopeful. "Fine," he muttered. "Test it." The engine roared to life, filling the hangar with thunder, and the Mustang, astonishingly, stayed steady. The test stand shuddered as the Merlin engine climbed through its RPM range, the prop blast rattling toolbox lids and sending stray papers tumbling across the hangar floor. Every mechanic flinched when the needle swept past the danger band, where the flutter usually began, where the coolant line would start singing its death note. But this time, nothing. The vibration curve held steady. The bracket, wrapped in an improvised lattice of silver tape, didn't flex, didn't tremble, didn't even hum. It simply endured. The maintenance chief exhaled so hard his breath fogged the glass. Shut it down. The engine wound down to a growl, then silence. He turned to Helen with a look she had never seen from him, respect, edged with fear at how close they had come to catastrophe. "It works," he whispered. "Damn it, Ward. It works." She didn't smile. There wasn't time. They had 3 hours before sunrise. The chief snapped to life. "All right, everyone listen up. We're retrofitting every Mustang on this line. Ward's pattern, exactly as she did it. Move!" The hangar erupted into motion. Mechanics sprinted for tool carts and tape rolls. Boxes were torn open. Ladders slammed against wing roots. Metal clanged. Voices echoed. Helen became a blur of motion, demonstrating angles, correcting tension, reinforcing weak points. Her hands moved faster than thought, driven by urgency, precision, and the cold knowledge that every strip of tape might be the difference between life and death. Engines cooled. Engines warmed. Tape crisscrossed brackets like metallic bandages. The floor vibrated with the footsteps of men racing the clock. By the time the horizon began to pale, 18 Mustangs stood ready, each carrying Helen's fingerprint in silver lines across their hearts. She didn't feel triumph, only fear. Because soon, those engines would meet the sky. And the sky was never forgiving. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, a thin red seam cutting through the darkness like a wound reopening. The air was sharp with cold and anticipation as the pilots strode toward their aircraft, helmets tucked under their arms, faces pale in the half-light. They exchanged the usual gallows humor, quick jabs, thin smiles, but Helen could see the tension beneath it, tight as wire. Each Mustang sat waiting, exhaust stacks steaming, the faint rumble of idling Merlins forming a restless chorus. The silver tape reinforcing their coolant brackets caught the morning light, glinting like makeshift armor. Most of the men hadn't noticed it yet. Those who did frowned. Torres muttered to a fellow mechanic, "Hope that arts and crafts project holds together." Helen ignored them, eyes fixed on the row of fighters. She stood back as pilots climbed in, checking harnesses, switching on fuel pumps, tapping gauges with practiced flicks. The commanding officer gave a curt nod. "Start 'em up." 18 engines roared to life simultaneously, and Helen's heart slammed against her ribs. She listened. Every vibration, every shudder, every rise in RPM. The harmonics stayed smooth, steady, alive. The Mustangs taxied out in twos, prop wash tearing through the cold air. Helen followed to the edge of the line, boots sinking into soft earth as she watched the formation take position. A flare hissed up. The squadron thundered down the runway, metal monsters clawing their way into the brightening sky. Helen shielded her eyes as they lifted, one after another, until the entire formation banked east and vanished into the clouds. Only then did the Radio Shack door swing open. Static crackled. Every mechanic stopped. The mission had begun, and Helen feared she'd hear either vindication or the sound of men dying because her idea wasn't enough. The Radio Shack was a cramped wooden box packed with equipment that hummed and buzzed like a nervous animal. Helen stood just inside the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the operator who adjusted dials with trembling fingers. The air felt thick, as if the entire field were holding its breath. The first transmission burst through abruptly. "Contact! Fighters at 2 o'clock. Closing fast." Voices overlapped, pilots calling positions, throttles opening, engines screaming through the static. Helen could almost picture it. Mustangs banking hard, wings flexing, Merlins pushed to their limits as the Luftwaffe descended like hawks. A sharp crackle, then a pilot's strained voice. "Boosting to full, coolant holding." Helen's knees nearly buckled. "Holding." Another voice cut in, breathless. "Brackets steady, no vibration. Whoever fixed these birds, buy 'em a whole damn brewery." The room erupted in stunned murmurs. The maintenance chief shot Helen a quick, disbelieving glance before turning back to the radio. Then came the chaos. "Brake left!" He's on your tail! Splash one! Mustang 4, you're clear! Taking fire, climbing! Damn, these engines are purring! Even amid the panic, there was awe in their voices. The Merlins weren't fighting the pilots, they were carrying them. Minutes felt like hours. Combat roared through the radio in fractured phrases, punctuated by gunfire and strained breathing. Helen forced herself to stay still, but every muscle trembled. Then finally, targets escorted, bombers away, turning for home. A pause. No losses. The operator exhaled sharply. Helen stared at the radio, unable to speak. Her fix hadn't just held. The airfield had never felt so silent. Mechanics lined the taxiway in a ragged row, tools forgotten, breath hanging in the cold morning air as they scanned the horizon with squinting, anxious eyes. Helen stood slightly apart from them, hands shoved into her pockets, heart hammering so hard it felt like part of her ribs might crack. Then, distant, faint, the unmistakable thrum of Merlin engines began to drift toward the field. Heads snapped upward. Shapes emerged from the clouds. One Mustang, then another, then the full formation sweeping low across the valley in a gleaming arc. Their wings shimmered silver in the new sunlight, engines harmonizing in a steady, confident roar Helen hadn't heard in weeks. The first fighter touched down, tires kicking up twin fans of dust. Then another, and another, each landing smooth, controlled, alive. Mechanics hurried forward, half in disbelief, half in relief. Not a single plane trailed smoke. Not a single engine coughed or sputtered. Helen didn't move until the last Mustang taxied in. The canopy slid open. The pilot climbed out, pulled off his helmet, and stared directly at her. "You, Ward?" he called over the ticking of the cooling engine. Helen nodded, throat tight. He pointed at the silver crosshatch of tape beneath the cowling. That little miracle kept my engine from shaking itself to pieces when a 190 got on my tail. He paused, voice softer. "You saved my life." Other pilots began stepping forward, glancing at their reinforced brackets, murmuring thanks, shaking their heads in stunned gratitude. Mechanics who'd mocked her now couldn't meet her eyes. Helen swallowed hard. She hadn't expected praise. She'd only hoped for survivors. Word traveled fast, faster than supply memos, faster than reprimands, faster even than rumors of incoming raids. By noon, officers from Engineering Command were stomping across the muddy airfield, greatcoats flapping behind them like angry banners. Their expressions were carved from stone, the kind that made mechanics straighten their backs and hide cigarettes behind toolboxes. Helen stood by Mustang 214 as they approached, hands clasped tightly behind her. She'd been summoned, not asked, and the familiar dread coiled in her stomach. Improvisation on military aircraft was a punishable offense. If they chose to make an example of her, no one would object, except maybe the pilots whose lives she'd spared. The lead engineer leaned into the open panel of 214's engine bay. His eyes narrowed at the cross-hatched web of silver reinforcing the coolant bracket. "This is regulation duct tape," he said flatly. Helen nodded. "Yes, sir." He straightened. "And you applied this to... how many aircraft?" 18, sir." A murmur rippled through the group. The chief engineer folded his arms. "Explain." Helen spoke clearly, each word measured. She described the vibration pattern, the bracket flex, the harmonic sink under boost, the stress fractures forming across the squadron. She explained how the tape's fiber weave absorbed micro-movement, redistributed tension, prevented resonance buildup. No dramatics, no apologies, just mechanical truth. Silence. Then, the engineer nearest the test stand stepped forward. "Sir, I reviewed the flight recordings. All vibration readings stayed within tolerance. Pressure held, temperatures held." He paused. Her fix prevented at least a dozen failures. Another engineer exhaled in disbelief. "With tape..." "It wasn't the tape," the lead engineer said quietly. "It was her." He turned to Helen. Not angry, not skeptical, respectful. "Ward, prepare your reinforcement method. We're issuing a field bulletin." Helen blinked. A bulletin. Her design, hers, would go out across every forward airbase in the theater. For the first time since the war began, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Validation. The sun was sinking low over the airfield when the day's frenzy finally eased, leaving behind only the distant rumble of departing jeeps and the soft tick-tick-tick of cooling engines. The Mustangs sat in neat lines, their metal glinting orange in the fading light, each one scarred by war yet standing straighter than they had that morning. Helen walked the row alone, fingertips grazing cowling after cowling, as though checking on old friends returning from battle. The pilots had finished debriefing hours earlier, but a few lingered by their aircraft, watching her with quiet acknowledgement. No cheering, no dramatic speeches, just nods that carried more weight than applause ever could. Men who had woken that morning expecting to die now stood breathing, living proof of her instincts, her stubbornness, her refusal to let a machine whisper a warning without listening. She paused at Mustang 214. The bracket she'd reinforced gleamed beneath the cowling light, the silver tape catching fire in the sunset. It would be replaced soon, upgraded by proper parts once supplies caught up. Engineers would credit the new design. Officers would sign off on reports. Historians might someday note an improvised field solution without naming the hands that created it, but the sky would remember. Helen rested her palm on the metal, feeling the faint warmth left by the engine. Machines didn't thank their keepers. They didn't praise or scold or commend. But they responded. They endured. They lived or died by the care given to them. Bootsteps approached. The commanding officer stopped beside her, cap tucked under his arm. "Ward," he said quietly, "you saved a squadron today." Helen didn't respond. The compliment wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that 18 pilots had come home. And sometimes, she realized, that was enough.